So I'm going to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we have participants from the West Coast of the United States, the East Coast. We have, I know, one participant from China, one from the Republic of Georgia, and maybe also from somewhere in Europe. So welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce one of our own CERES graduates, Nina Jankowicz. She graduated in 2013. She is currently the Woodrow Wilson Center's Disinformation Fellow. That's a pretty good title. She has written widely on issues of disinformation. She's advised the Ukrainian government. She spent time in Ukraine on these issues. She, as I said, she's a prolific author. And she has really, in the 7 years since she graduated from CERES, built up a career and a great reputation as an expert on these issues. She was just telling me that last night she was on the PBS NewsHour discussing the latest Russian attempt to hack data on the COVID vaccine. I see we have Professor Twig here, so maybe this will come up later on in the discussions. And so what Nina is going to do is to give us a talk about her book, How to Lose the Information War. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions. So Nina, we're delighted to have you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stent. It's really wonderful to be with the CERES community again. As I think I said when I wrote to you to ask you to blurb the book, which you so kindly did, this is really a CERES book. It is an area studies book. Without my experience at CERES, it would not have come to fruition, frankly. The language skills I developed there and the different multidisciplinary kind of approaches were just really important in gathering this information and getting it out there. Also the writing skills that I honed at CERES. So thank you so much for that, and do believe in your area studies degrees, folks, because I think I'm a true believer in them. I always have been. So a little bit about me and how I got to where I am, because it's kind of a circuitous path from writing about EU integration in 2013 in my capstone to here today. After I graduated from CERES, I ended up at the National Democratic Institute, where for a couple of years I was the program officer on Russia and Belarus programs. And for those that might not be as familiar with NDI, it supports democracy activists all around the world. Its Eurasian program is one of the oldest programs, and our programs in Russia and Belarus, just before I joined the Institute, were basically very kindly asked to leave both of those countries, and we were operating offshore, supporting election monitors, party activists, civil society groups, etc., who were looking to create more responsive governance in Russia and Belarus. And particularly in Russia, as a result of the exit of US aid from Russia, a day which I remember very clearly standing in the CERES library and thinking like, what does this mean for all of our careers? But as we can see, Russia has clearly made quite a splash back onto the international scene. So again, those area studies degrees are certainly worth a lot right now. The exit of USAID meant that NDI was branded, because it had some USAID funding, as kind of a color revolution organization, or a CIA front, certainly a vector of that terrible foreign influence. And as a result, we were often bandied about in Russian domestic propaganda. All sorts of terrible things were ascribed to our organization. And it was something that early on in my career, I started to think about, because being one of the young people on the team at NDI, I was pushing for us to have a more proactive stance on social media, to be more transparent about what we were doing, because a lot of the stuff that the Russian government was ascribing to us was things that were way beyond our budget, and certainly not within the remit of what NDI was doing. That was a really formative experience for me. The undesirable foreign organization law came into effect and named NDI as one of the original undesirable foreign organizations. And around the same time, that's when the war in Ukraine started. And although I wasn't working directly on NDI's Ukraine program, I certainly was working alongside colleagues who were and paying very close attention to everything that was going on in Ukraine. And I decided it was time for me to get out into the field and do something that was a bit more hands-on and hopefully could also help with the skills that I had under my belt, both in terms of understanding of social media and communications, but my area studies skills as well. And that's where the Fulbright Public Policy Program came into my life. I put in an application to work on strategic communications and counter disinformation in Ukraine through this program, which places mid-career professionals as advisors in different government ministries. And I was lucky enough to be placed in the foreign ministry in Ukraine, where I worked with the spokesperson, Mariana Betsa, for a whole year on countering Russian influence and Ukraine's outreach mostly to its international partners. And this was a really critical year, not only because things in Ukraine were on a bit of a roller coaster. This was the year that Avdiivka and the shelling of Avdiivka happened. Certainly, lots of consequential votes just after the Netherlands referendum on Ukraine's association agreement. Ukraine was pursuing visa-free travel, lots of important things going on in Ukraine. Of course, it was also the year that we learned about Russian interference in our own election in the United States. And that's where really the idea for this book was born. I was on the ground in Ukraine when the election happened, and frankly, very dismayed at the rhetoric I was seeing at home and in other Western countries about their shock and awe related to Russian interference, when anyone who had been paying attention to the past 10 years in Central and Eastern Europe in the post-Soviet and post-communist space would see that this was a pattern of engagement by the Russian government and Russian-aligned operatives, including the Internet Research Agency, including state-sponsored criminal organizations and hackers that were trying to exert this influence, not only online, but in the offline kind of murky spheres of monetary influence and funding of organizations and fake experts, et cetera. And in the intervening, several months in my last, the end of the chunk of my time in Ukraine, I really started thinking about this book, interviewing people, and it took 3 years, but here it is finally out in the world. So I'm very, very happy to be speaking about it to you today. And I think it couldn't be more relevant, frankly, although I did not think I was going to be releasing the book during the quote unquote infodemic. I don't think it could be more relevant today as we deal with an unprecedented flow of malicious information that is not only causing threats to our national security, but to our public safety and public health as well. I want to talk about three kind of lines that run through the book throughout the 5 case studies that I present. So I start in Estonia in 2007 with an overview of the bronze soldier crisis and the Estonian government's response to that over the intervening 13 years. Then I moved to Georgia in 2008, where I look at the 2008 war, its repercussions, and the unfortunate kind of degradation of Georgia's originally very robust stance against Russian influence in Georgia. Then I look at Poland, which of course, there's no love lost between Poland and Russia. And yet Poland is not inoculated to Russian disinformation. And in fact, because of the Polish government's alacrity for using disinformation tactics on its own population, it kind of undercuts the countering of Russian disinformation that they've been investing in over the past several years. Then I look at Ukraine and the Netherlands referendum, which is just such an interesting case study because it showed an opportunity for Russia not only to undermine EU cohesion, but to undermine Ukraine's international support in the EU and beyond. And it's also just an interesting case of the fact that narratives can't always win the day. Just having a great story to tell doesn't mean that you're going to change people's minds. We really need to address root causes of these disinformation narratives or the vulnerabilities in our society that make them possible in order to have a cohesive response. And then finally, I look at the Czech Republic, which was one of the nations that originally got its own domestic response to Russian disinformation sorted, but the policy response didn't necessarily rise to meet the challenge because of the domestic political situation, which I think is very akin to what we're seeing here in the United States today. Pockets of the federal government, which are doing good work on on Russian disinformation, but unfortunately, their work and their messaging is undermined by messages that are coming from other parts of the government. So those are the 5 case studies I look at, and what are the things that unite them? First of all, there's always a homegrown element to these operations. They don't work in a vacuum. Russia is not creating these fissures in our societies. It is amplifying them. And so once it latches on to one of those fissures, it finds conduits of that information. Sometimes they are witting, sometimes they are unwitting, but those homegrown elements always exist. And we really need to recognize that, again, because we can't counter foreign disinformation if we are using it on our own citizens and saying it's okay if it's coming from a domestic vector. It's bad no matter where it's coming from. Secondly, and this is related, there's always a human element to these operations. Disinformation in particular runs on emotion. That's why we're seeing so much of it right now during this very uncertain and fearful time. And of course, because social media platforms incentivize that engagement around emotion, that's how they make money. This is a key, I think, point that we miss very much in our response here in the United States and in a few other Western countries. We tend to securitize this problem and say, you know, targeted sanctions, content moderation, this is the way that we can address it, when we're not really getting at the fissures in our societies that make it possible in the first place. As the Black Lives Matter protests are going on, as we have, you know, rampant racism and economic inequality in the United States, we can't you know, hope to make ourselves less vulnerable, more resilient to disinformation, unless we're solving those problems that make it possible in the first place, just to use our own country as an example. Similar examples, of course, in the ethnic divides in Estonia and polarization in Poland around the plane crash in 2010 in Smolensk. Those are just 2 examples off the top of my head. But those are the types of things we really need to look at. And then finally, again, we can't counter disinformation if we're not going to recognize it and recognize that it is a threat to democracy writ large, not just something that affects one political party or another. And that's something that too few governments have really taken on board wholeheartedly. And it's something that I will continue to get on my soapbox about over the next couple of months as we head toward an election, because I think there's a responsibility that politicians have to be, you know, adherents of the truth. And right now they're disincentivized from telling the truth. It's much more profitable for them in the political realm to traffic in disinformation. And that's unfortunate. And it's up to our citizens to hold people accountable, to hold our elected officials accountable for what they say and how they act. If we had more political will in the United States, some of the solutions that have worked across these countries include investing in media and digital literacy, investing in civics, building up public media, journalism as a public service. If you look at the most resilient countries, even those outside of the 5 that I detail in the book, countries like Sweden and Finland, they're all investing a lot more in their media environment than the United States is. We spend $3 per person per year on our Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I really would like to see that increased by a significant margin, understanding that, you know, that's not palatable to a lot of Americans, but we need a vector of trustworthy information at this time when information is truly atrophying, especially in the local environment. NPR and PBS fill in some of the news deserts in the nation's heartland and in the South, where otherwise they would not have any local news serving their communities. And that is critical, because where there is that vacuum, that is where malign actors, both foreign and domestic, can slide in and exploit that. And there also needs to be a regulatory response. I don't think we'll focus as much on that today, given the audience and the regional focus. I'm sure we'll get into a great discussion about some of these case studies. But really, the United States has been abdicating its responsibility, not only to its own citizens, but to the rest of the world in terms of putting together democratic, human rights-based social media regulation. Because of the polarization of this topic, we really have not started even to grapple with those questions and not even addressed the lowest hanging fruit in the regulatory framework of social media regulation. So I think I'll stop there and we can take some questions. I'm really, really happy to be here. So thank you for being here and engaging.
Thank you so much, Nina. Let me just tell the participants, probably the easiest thing is to actually go to the participants and do raise hand, so then I can know who would like to ask a question. As Nina said, I did give a blurb to her book. It's a terrific book, and I recommend that you all buy it. So let me just push you a little further now on what's happening in these United States. In 3.5 months, we'll have an election. What should we be looking for in the next 3.5 months, in the period leading up to November the 3rd?
Well, I have written a lot about the closed spaces on the internet that I am worried about. I had a piece in Wired with another researcher on disinformation, Cindy Otis, in June, and the title was "Facebook Groups Are Destroying America." I would go farther and say that they're destroying plenty of other countries as well, but this was the audience that we were writing for. And I think what's happening is because the platforms have been incentivized to move conversations to a more private, community-oriented space, people have been segmented not only around local kind of lines, but around their interests and vulnerabilities as well. So for instance, I've been monitoring a lot of the dialogue around reopening economies, and I've taken a particular interest in New Jersey, as that is where I am from. So monitoring some of these groups and the things that are being shared in there, I mean, I would say 95% of it is false information. We don't know the vector exactly through which it's traveling, but there is malign intent behind it, whether it's coming from a domestic or foreign source, we're not sure. But it's really detrimental to public health and public safety, as I mentioned before. And we just don't know the extent of it because Facebook itself, and I pick on Facebook a lot, but it is the most ubiquitous of these platforms, is a closed platform. So in order to gather this information, we basically need to break Facebook's terms of service, either through dummy accounts through which we can infiltrate these groups, or by using tools that technically go against Facebook's terms of service to scrape data from there. So we don't know the extent of the problem. And what does that mean for the average user when they're engaging in a group about their local town in New Jersey and how they want, a debate about whether they should be reopening or not? I think we all just need to be careful, even if someone purports to be from your town, with the same interests as you, they may not be who they say they are. And the sources of information that people are sharing are still, unfortunately, quite spurious. There's a lot of misattribution of images in particular. People are linking to sources that aren't doing the proper investigation or confirmation of the information that they're getting. So it's incumbent on users to start to do that stuff. And it's really not very difficult to do some lateral reading, to check if something is being reported in one space, if it's being reported anywhere else, to learn how to do a reverse image search, which if the folks on this call don't know how to do, I would encourage you to learn, because it's one of the simplest ways to check if an image has been misattributed. And that happens a lot. Always in Washington around hurricane season, we see those images of sharks swimming in the Potomac. Reverse image search can quickly dispense with those rumors and some nastier rumors as well. So that's number one. Number two, I hope we are seeing some strong messaging from both the federal and state governments about what to expect on election day. I'm sure we have some folks on the call who have done election monitoring. We all know that, especially when we're going to be hand counting ballots, and there are going to be more, physical paper ballots than normal here in this election because of mail-in balloting, it's going to take longer to achieve a result that we are confident with, right? And I think we need to be messaging to the public that we cannot expect instant gratification here, and that in those intervening hours, that's a very delicate time when a lot of disinformation could proliferate. So we should all be seeking information just from, I would say, your local and state election boards, not listening to politicians, not listening to pundits. We need to really hone in on those really trusted vectors of information. And unfortunately, I think most Americans don't even know where to look when we start talking about that. So that messaging needs to start now. And I am a little bit worried about what's going to happen in November. I think the full extent of the interference won't be evident until afterward, as it was in 2016, because again, we lack the transparency and oversight to get into these platforms and understand what's happening in real time, but also because we tend to see elections as an inflection point. We tend to see them as the prize, but these campaigns have continued since 2016. They started long before 2016. They continued after. In the book, I write about a flash mob that occurred in front of the White House that the Russians sponsored in July of 2017. There's evidence in 2018, of course, that Russia was meddling in the midterms as well. Interference is a long game. It's a generational game. And that's why getting those systems in place for generational solutions is also really important. It won't help us in November, but we need to start thinking about that now. And I do feel that we've squandered a lot of the last 4 years in not getting any of those solutions in place.
We have to remember that we probably won't know the results of the election until not the same night, maybe not the next day. Okay, Professor David Fox, please, you're next.
Hi, thank you for coming to us today because I missed your talk at the Kennan, and I'm going to be interested in reading your book in part for my own selfish reasons, which is I'm teaching a new course on the history of propaganda in the Soviet Union, and of course the media ecosystem and the technology is new, but disinformation is an older phenomenon. So I'm wondering what you have learned about the design and methods of these disinformation campaigns that might be then compared to historical examples.
Sure. So the way that I delineate that in the book is clearly, you know, disinformation existed in the Soviet Union. I think it served a different goal, which was to promote the Soviet worldview, generally speaking. Here, I like to describe disinformation more like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Often we've seen the Russian Federation manipulating different sides of the political spectrum, turning them against each other. It's not necessarily to serve a political purpose, but rather to get people to doubt that there is a truth, to get people to distrust the system, to distrust each other, and widen those fissures in society that already exist. Because when this happens, we are turned inward. We're paying less attention to what Putin is doing in his near abroad and in the farther abroad as well. And we, in some ways, are allowing ourselves to pump up Russia back to its seat at the global negotiating table, which if you look at the past 4 years, despite the annexation of Crimea, despite what happened in 2016 and the consequences, even despite the Skripal poisonings in 2018, we are still for some reason considering allowing Russia back to the G7, soon to be G8, or hopefully not soon, but this is something that's on the table, not just from President Trump, but from Macron as well. We elevate Russia to the status of a great power. And that's exactly what Putin has been trying to achieve. And there hasn't been a day in the news that we've not spoken about Russia, except for perhaps at the very beginning of the coronavirus crisis, which Russia very quickly changed by sending us a plane full of PPE from Russia with love, right? They've achieved that status. And I think that is part of what disinformation is about, rebranding Russia as a global world power.
Our next question comes from Yangling Pan. He is an incoming CERES student and he's joining us from China. Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much for Professor Stent for hosting the event, and thank you for coming to talk to us. I didn't read the entirety of your book. I read about 50% of it, and as I understand, the book is mostly about defensive measures against Russian information campaigns, such as educating people and fixing the fissures in society. But I thought if the information war is really a war, then a country has to have some offensive measures as well to fight back and impose costs on the enemy. So do you think it would be a good idea for a country trying to fight Russian information campaigns to establish its own some sort of internet research agency and, you know, retaliate, to use similar techniques to sort of disrupt Russia's political scene in the same way that Russia has disrupted other countries? At the least that would do, right, is to force the Kremlin to consider what cost their attacks might bring, and hopefully rein back their disruption and their information campaigns abroad.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question. I don't think that we should be adopting the same tactics that the Kremlin does. I think our values need to guide our response here, and we should err toward, you know, things like funding investigative journalism, funding outlets like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, which are crucial vectors of information, trustworthy information in the entire post-Soviet space. We should be, you know, supporting groups that are doing investigative journalism on the ground there, rather than, you know, always just counter messaging from the US government or US government entities, because often, you know, we don't have the same trust that local journalists or local activists are going to have. They also know their countries a lot better than we do. I think, you know, in general, erring toward openness and transparency in those offensive measures, and making sure that the folks on the ground who are doing the dangerous and important work of reporting on, you know, the crimes that these regimes commit, or inequalities in their societies that are perpetuated by the systems, that sort of thing is going to be much more effective in the long run than you know, blatant counter messaging. And that's not to say there aren't parts of the US government that have done or perhaps continue to do this in the covert sphere. There's plenty of governments that do that, but in the overt sphere, I absolutely think that openness and transparency are the things that should guide us. You know, the tenets of democracy, propping them up, increasing our investment in the fourth estate in particular, is really, really important. I do think, however, that deterrent measures are critical, particularly when we're talking about the cyber side of disinformation and how it informs disinformation. So Dr. Stent was talking about the hack of the vaccine researchers. You know, I was getting into an argument with some folks on Twitter who don't believe that in this case deterrence would be effective because, you know, Russia was always going to try to hack that intellectual property. That might be true. I still think we need to establish rules and costs for those rules. And I do think there are ways to do targeted deterrent measures, as we've seen, you know, either targeting with power shutdown, cyber attacks, the groups that are responsible for these attacks, or targeted sanctions. I believe they can be effective in this case as well. And even if they don't have an immediate effect, I think it's important to stand up for and safeguard those international rules and norms, which seem to have been abandoned recently.
Jill Doherty, you had a follow-up question to Michael David Fox?
I do. It's great to hear you again, Nina. I hear you everywhere, and I'm so glad that you are everywhere, because it's really important. But I just wanted to follow up on what Michael said, which was he's talking about the Soviet approach to disinformation, and we know many of those techniques. But, you know, just I really love your perspective on how the internet changed things. Now, I mean, obviously it changed the method of disseminating information, but did it change the message? What do you think?
Well, I think the social media platforms allow Russia to segment their messages and target them at exactly those who are most vulnerable to them. It's not just that it spreads faster and wider than it used to. It's that Russia can target those messages and test them. And not just Russia. Again, I like to say that disinformation has been democratized. All you need is an account and a credit card, and sometimes not even a credit card, because again, you don't always need to buy an ad to make something go viral on the internet if you know what you're doing. And Russia certainly knows what it's doing, and it has the time and resources to invest in all of this stuff. It's quite cheap, actually, to invest in some of these campaigns. So again, it's that segmentation of audience, the ability to test over time and see what's most engaging, and then to continually drive those messages home over time. Some of the pages that were most influential from the Internet Research Agency in 2016 were started in 2013 and 2014. And what's fascinating about them isn't just that they were constantly driving home fake divisive messages. Actually, they started with very, very positive messaging. They started, one of my favorite examples, I use this everywhere, and some of you have probably heard it before, but the Being Patriotic Facebook page, which was kind of a jingoistic, patriotic, right-leaning page, shared a picture in 2014, I believe, of a golden retriever who was wearing a red and white flag bandana and had a little American flag between his paws. And the text on the picture said, "Like if you think it's going to be a great week." Now, I would probably like that that picture. I have a dog. I am a dog lover. I think cute dogs are great. And that's not disinformation, right? It's disinformation because it's coming from an inauthentic account, but the actual content is not false or inflammatory or misleading in any way. And they use tactics like this to build community over time, to create trust in these spaces that they created, and then over and over to gradually increase the asks. So it wasn't just like if you think it's going to be a great week, it was like if you think our Second Amendment rights are the most important rights that we need to safeguard, or like if you think, police lives matter, change your profile picture in support of the All Lives Matter movement, sign this petition, show up to a protest, right? The behavior gradually scaled up over time. And that was possible because of that segmentation of the audience and the long-term understanding of what made them tick and what they engaged with.
Great. Ryan Kurtz, you're the next one.
Hi, Nina. Thanks for speaking with us today. Obviously, disinformation is a lot easier when you control all the media outlets, but how would you compare both the narratives and the different methods by which Russia utilizes disinformation for domestic audiences compared to foreign audiences?
That's a great question. And I'm sure you've read Peter Pomerantsev's book about disinformation, domestic disinformation, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. So if you haven't, I would highly recommend that to folks who haven't taken a look. I think it's less about division, right, with the domestic propaganda, and it harkens back to that Soviet era view of things that we are more familiar with. I think it's interesting to look at coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests in the domestic sphere in Russia, which actually a lot of folks are pointing out hasn't been, disinformation. It hasn't been filled with lies. It's just classic whataboutism. They look at, the abuse against different journalists here in the United States as they were covering the protests, the violence, and say, look at the protests here in Russia and how the United States reacted. All the times the United States has tried to give us a talking to about human rights and press freedom, and look what's going on over there. And it's not necessarily untrue, right, that these things have been happening in the United States. So it just takes that pro-Russian viewpoint, that whataboutist viewpoint. Whereas in the international arena, again, I feel like Russia has a lot fewer scruples about who it supports, as long as it is driving that division and keeping us engaged with our own domestic problems, ignoring what's going on abroad.
Great, thank you.
Professor Judy Twigg.
Hi, thank you, Angela, and thanks very much, Nina. So we have some news about what's happening with the coronavirus vaccine research over the last 24 hours. In the best of all possible worlds, we have a viable vaccine or several viable vaccines over the next 6 months or year or so. And that's going to bring back a lot of the controversy about the anti-vaccine propaganda that comes out of Russia. It's mortifying to look at the public opinion polls here in the United States and realize how many people out of hand will just reject a COVID-19 vaccine once it's available. So I have two questions about the support of Russian disinformation specifically for anti-vaccine propaganda. One is about what you saw in Ukraine when you were there, because there have been huge consequences for Russian disinfo around vaccines in Ukraine. An outbreak of polio back in the summer of 2015. I'm wondering how much you saw of that activity when you were there, and specifically who the Russians' Ukrainian allies were in that kind of activity. There were winners among the incredibly corrupt public procurement actors, a lot of industrial actors. How did those dynamics play out? And then the second question is about the United States and whether or not you see the Russian-sourced anti-vax propaganda ramping up as we near, hopefully, the launch of a coronavirus vaccine.
Yeah, the Ukraine question is great. It's interesting. The first indication to me that there was going to be a problem around coronavirus disinformation was when there was a fake email from the Ukrainian Ministry of Health that was released in, I believe, February, when Ukraine was evacuating citizens from Wuhan. And this fake email claimed that there were many people who were infected. I believe none of them were actually infected, and that they were going to a sanatorium in a small Ukrainian town and they would be allowed to roam free. And this caused riots. It was pretty striking. And that's when I knew we had a problem on our hands, especially if we had a huge outbreak here. And so again, Russia has used health disinformation around the world. It's particularly pernicious in Ukraine, where the public health system is lacking, to be diplomatic about it. And certainly the vectors of disinformation, and this is really counterintuitive, but the vectors of disinformation, health disinformation in Ukraine, especially around reform of the medical system, were coming from a lot of doctors themselves, who I think Russia understood were weak links in the system. They wanted to keep their hold on the system as it was because they benefited from it, and were worried about if the system shifted to a more democratic, kind of equitable version, which is what Ulana Suprun was trying to do during her time as health minister, that they would kind of lose their status. So there were definitely some corrupt doctors who were pushing that sort of stuff as well. And the health ministry in Ukraine, I think, tried to use another interesting vector, one that is perhaps a little bit more trusted in society, which was the Orthodox Church, to deliver messaging, counter messaging about that. I don't know if that's been continued during the Zelensky administration, but certainly, you know, not just about vaccines, but about the access to healthcare surrounding those reforms. That was a huge issue, and I think continues to be one. And then regarding, you know, Russian coronavirus disinformation and vaccine disinformation, I think there is no question in my mind they are going to latch on. This is such a growing narrative here in the United States, even endemically, without outside interference. There's no question that Russia is going to try to seize on these narratives. There's a long history of, obviously, this sort of health interference. We look at the AIDS campaign, which is the famous example that everybody knows about Operation Infection, claiming that the AIDS virus was created by the CIA. We've seen a lot of those narratives proliferating already, and Russia really has to do very little. In some cases, they don't even have to create the content. The Plandemic video is a great example of that. It far exceeded any of the content we were seeing coming out of overt Russian propaganda, like RT and Sputnik around that time during the coronavirus, created by, you know, US fringe characters. And all they have to do is really is amplify it, and they can do that through those overt measures. They can share it in groups, and you know, who's to say that's not authentic American actors that are doing that stuff? That plausible deniability is going to be really important for them to manipulate, not only around the vaccine, but as we head toward the election. And it makes it very hard for the platforms to respond as well.
Nick Kalawiak?
Yeah, hi Nina, thanks again for being here with us. It's been a super interesting conversation. I'd like to circle back a bit to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, VOA, which you mentioned briefly earlier. And there's been a recent, I guess we could call it a shakeup at the US Agency for Global Media, with the resignations, Michael Pack being confirmed on a basically a party line vote in Congress. And to me, this seems like a sort of a warning light about the US's ability to, you know, kind of provide some sort of journalism abroad. So I wonder, is this as big a danger as it seems to me? Am I hyping myself up too much, or is this, yeah, what do you make of these changes?
Yeah, it's very, very disturbing to me, particularly as someone who saw the effects of all of that coverage in a place like Ukraine, or even, you know, in Georgia when I was there last summer, some of the coverage of the protests that were going on in June 2019, some of the best coverage was coming from Radio Free Europe. Otherwise, it was quite difficult to kind of weed out the partisanship there. I wrote about, in the conclusion to my book, there's like this dystopic future scenario in which I imagine what would happen if we continued on the track that we're on. And I predicted that the Trump administration, if elected to a second term, would try to dismantle and defund these outlets of US soft power and influence. And lo and behold, they're doing it even before the potential second term, which is really discouraging to me. There's a couple of reasons for that. Again, we want to be investing in this informational vector. There are other places in Europe that need this as well. I think either RFE or VOA is looking at expanding to Hungary because of the democratic backsliding there. It's just so important to invest in that journalism as a public good again. But there are other places like Belarus, which has had a lot of protests over the past couple of weeks in the lead up to their presidential election. RFERL journalists have been arrested several times, and this used to elicit some sort of response from the US government. We've had a couple of statements from the embassy in Minsk, along with some of our allies, including the UK and the EU. But it's not been something that, you know, the Secretary of State or the spokesperson at the State Department has addressed from the podium in any briefings. This hasn't caused any outrage, and that really worries me because it leads to the normalization of the degradation of press freedom, right? It's something that's extremely worrying. And also the editorial independence of RFE and VOA is not only dangerous for, you know, the standard of journalism that the United States should be supporting, it's also dangerous because it affects the safety of many of the local journalists who are reporting on these issues. Not to mention the staff here in Washington. Most of RFE and VOA staff are folks who are citizens who have moved here from the countries that getting sent home and are known to be working for something that is increasingly looking like a propaganda outlet. That's very worrisome to me because RFE and VOA have always maintained their editorial independence. They have always maintained good standards of journalism. And folks who compare them to RT or Sputnik are just completely out of their depth because, you know, they are doing journalism. They are citing their sources. Although it is paid for by US government funding, there is a degree of editorial independence that RT and Sputnik cannot dream to have. So I think we're making a huge mistake with this to underline that. I'm sure it was clear, but I really hope to see all those decisions reversed. There's also a lot of concerning stuff happening with the Open Technology Fund, which funds things like Signal, which a lot of democratic activists, not just in the Eurasia region, use to communicate and keep themselves safe. And that's another really concerning development that isn't just about, you know, a propaganda arm, it's about people's actual safety on the ground.
Professor Smith.
Hi, Nina. First of all, congratulations on your book. I know it felt like it took a long time, but by academic standards, you're like a publishing whiz to get your ideas out there so quickly. So really great to see you here today. My question has to do with your case studies. So the United States is not really famous for taking lessons from other countries, especially Eastern Europe. And I wonder if your case studies revealed some kind of best practices that you think could be translated to a US setting.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. And Professor Smith provided some early comments on my manuscript, which I really, really appreciated and the book really benefited from. So thank you for that. What the case studies can show us, I think, again, is that it's really important to invest in humans at the heart of these solutions and not securitize the problem overly. If you look at Estonia, the real turnaround in integration between the Russian population and the Estonian population happened when the government was investing in Russian language media, when it was investing in education for Russian speakers and kind of trying to equalize career opportunities and economic opportunities that were available. Something in the more tangible sphere was that the presidential administration of Estonia took a physical sabbatical where they moved from Tallinn to Narva for a week or two in September of 2018. To say to the folks in Narva, we see you, we're here to listen to your problems. It's kind of, you know, a PR move to some extent, but these people want to know that they're heard, right? And that's true for any of the marginalized populations that we're talking about in any country that we're talking about. So I think Estonia is a great example. Obviously, it is the size of a mid-sized, American city, small American city even. So it's a maybe slightly easier for them. They have mostly that one fissure to kind of fill in. But that doesn't mean that the United States certainly can't take some lessons from Estonia. And I think the other theme is just the clear-eyed recognition of the threat, and the threat not only to our national security, but to our democratic system. And that deserves, defense from our government. All of these governments have that clear-eyed recognition of the threat. When it doesn't come from the very top of the political, pyramid, they run into some problems because, again, those efforts throughout their governments then tend to be undermined from above. And I think that's what we're seeing here today. So hopefully we can see some more responsible leadership coming not only from, this isn't only about the presidency, it has to do with local politicians and Congress as well. And I think we're increasingly starting to see that realization, and hopefully, folks in their protests, in their engagement, civic engagement through voting and other means, are going to continue to hold our politicians accountable to a higher standard than we have been incentivized to engage with over the last couple of years.
Keegan Scott.
Thank you, Nina, for being here. It's really great to hear what you have to say. So my question actually deals with media consolidation. In a lot of illiberal regimes like Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, you see a lot of traditional media sources becoming, consolidated or simply owned by one conglomerate. Do you see any attempts by the Russians to either, influence or infiltrate these kind of institutions, since a lot of the work, I suppose, of dividing is being done for them? Or what do you think?
Yeah, in those specific cases that you've mentioned, I'm not aware of any sort of vectors of influence, either witting or unwitting, directly in those institutions. Russia has been investing increasingly in its overt kind of messaging arms in RT and Sputnik, which most of them have local language affiliates that they kind of do content aggregation with. So they'll have a Russian language version or an English language version of an article that gets then translated and reprinted in all of those markets. And they do have effect. I mean, in Poland, Sputnik Poland is actually more popular than I would like to admit, and they've got their own radio station in Poland as well. So I think they want to be looking more at their own media outlets when they're able to kind of create them and push them. But when they're not, instead, what we'll see is the tactic of information laundering, where either through a hack and leak operation that is then given to state media or any other media, sometimes fringe media, depending on what country we're talking about, or a narrative that jumps from the pages of RT and Sputnik to more authentic, legitimate local sources, as this happened a lot in the Netherlands referendum regarding Ukraine's association agreement in 2016. There were narratives on Sputnik Netherlands that then would make their way onto fringe right and left political blogs, and suddenly were part of the national conversation. I think that is a less risky method of influence, and again, allows Russia that plausible deniability.
And now Tina Dolbaya, she's an incoming CERES student joining us from Georgia.
Great.
Hi. Thank you so much, Nina, for your presentation. I haven't yet read your book, but both your book and your professional experiences seem highly fascinating to me. At some point in your speech, you mentioned about your trip to Georgia during the 2008 August war, if I'm not mistaken. And contrary to what our government and then President Mikhail Saakashvili used to tell us, it's clear today that we lost the information war with Russia back then. But I think that the year 2008 was an interesting time because, social media platforms that are extremely popular today, especially Facebook, were not as developed or prevalent across the world in 2008. So do you think if these media platforms, primarily Facebook, were as widely used back then as they are today, we would be more successful in terms of this information war, or, you know, disseminating our side of the truth? And I also have a follow-up question in this regard, which may not be directly connected to your book, but, you know, I'm interested in your opinion in this regard. From my experience, most Russians use this government-controlled media platform called Kontakte instead of Facebook. And how does this fact impact their knowledge and awareness, you know, what they know and what they don't know about what is going on around the world?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you. Both really good questions. So one point of clarification, I've been to Georgia many times, unfortunately not in 2008. When I was talking about when I was in Georgia last, that was June 2019, as the protests were going on. I was there in Tbilisi, really fascinating to watch. And of course, that was about Russian influence as well. But looking at the 2008 war through today, I think you're absolutely right. There was an information war going on. That was part of one of the main vectors of the conflict. And it was fought on the international airwaves to a large degree. What's interesting, though, if you look at Margarita Simonyan and her statements about 2008, she actually cites that as one of the reasons for creating RT, because, and I think this is a direct quote, she says, "We looked so pale in comparison to the Georgians, who had Saakashvili and other English-speaking officials on CNN constantly during the conflict. And Russia wasn't able to muster that sort of emotional narrative that really drew people in." So I wouldn't really discount Georgia's pluckiness in that regard during the 2008 conflict. Now, what's been unfortunate to watch is the way that the Georgian information ecosystem, which was once really quite aggressive in countering Russia, has now allowed Russian influence to creep back in the forms of cultural organizations like the Orthodox Congress from last summer, also in the form of some media and exchange organizations. And all of that's detailed in the book. If social media had existed in 2008, I think, you know, the playing field might have been leveled out a little bit more, because Russia is, you know, adept at using these vectors of information to, again, reach exactly the populations that it needed to. It would have been able to, for instance, target specific communities in Georgia and specific international audiences with, you know, malign narratives about what was going on there. And that information could have spread very far and gotten out of control quite quickly. So in a murky situation, that would have made the waters even murkier. And if you look to, for instance, the downing of MH17, which was 6 years ago today, that's the sort of situation that I think we might have seen in Georgia in that time. And remind me quickly your second question, because it's flown out of my head.
That's fine. Thank you for your answer. So my second question was connected to the usage of Facebook in Russia.
Kontakte, right. Okay. So interestingly, yeah, I think Kontakte, for me, it's less about the quality of the information that's being shared there. I think there's probably plenty of decent quality information. It's more about the surveillance that Kontakte allows to happen. It's pretty well known that the government is not only watching Kontakte, but certainly watching Facebook as well. But it has, you know, back-end access to most of these Russian platforms to be able to surveil populations there. And I think that's what's scariest about it. Now, that being said, I would not recommend to any democratic nation that they block Russian platforms, or that we block TikTok, for instance, as we've been discussing with regard to China. That's just not really a democratic response to you know, information in any sphere. And in Ukraine, where they've blocked Yandex, Kontakte, and Odnoklassniki, we've actually seen those sites remain in the top 10 most accessed sites in Ukraine. Most Ukrainians have now learned how to use a VPN to get around those restrictions. And I think it just honestly is a fairly draconian response to something that you could counter by saying, you know, recruitment to the Russian armed services and separatists movements happens on these spaces. You are being surveilled. Your data is being vacuumed up. People go to jail for their posts that they make on social media. I think that is the more democratic way to approach things than, you know, blocking them and hermetically sealing the information environment.
Great, thank you. I think, Ryan, do you have another question?
If that's all right.
Yeah, it is. This will be the last one.
I have more of a domestically focused question because I feel like we've sort of danced around political misinformation from certain parts of the US political sphere. But what do you think the ultimate consequences will be of the proliferation of like QAnon conspiracy theories and other far-right conspiracy theories into more mainstream conservative thought? And do you think that'll continue to persist even after Trump leaves the center stage of the Republican Party?
So yes, a fairly political question, and I should preface it by saying that this and all of my comments do not represent the views of the Wilson Center, but are my own personal views. Basically, I am very worried about the kind of intersection of mainstream Republican thought with these conspiracy theories. I'll have a piece coming out in the Atlantic in a couple, hopefully next week, about how the anti-vax and the reopen movements have kind of collided. And certainly we're seeing that collision in the mainstream political space as well. We have seen multiple candidates for Congress endorse openly the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is just, I mean, it's bonkers. And so if those folks, there's no other way to describe it, if those folks are elected, and some of them have already cleared their primaries, that's going to be endemic to Congress. And we've certainly seen other similar conspiracy theories aired during the impeachment proceedings. Frankly, the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory is something that holds absolutely no rigor or water, and yet it was aired and entered into the congressional record. And you know, I don't have time to go into exactly what that is, but I did a segment on Fareed Zakaria if you want me to break it down for you, so you could look that up. But yeah, it's very, very concerning. And I think this is where we need to work out the incentives for, you know, politicians in this case. We have not set rules for campaigning online that are akin to what we have in print and TV and radio, especially with regard to advertising. And I think if we get those rules of the road established, it will slow down. It will not stop, but it will slow down and create some friction with these conspiracy theories getting aired in a campaign environment. At least what happens outside of the campaign environment is much more difficult to restrict, but at least we should not be giving them oxygen and, you know, creating these environments for slander and libel throughout the campaign environment. And that is something I hope to see changing with the next Congress.
Thank you.
This is a cautionary note to end on. This was a terrific discussion, Nina. Congratulations again. Everyone should go and purchase in some form How to Lose the Information War. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, in the next few months and next years. And, you know, good luck with the rest of your virtual book tour. And thank you very much for coming. And CERES students and graduates, you know, you too can do it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you, and good luck with the school year.
Great. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.